Chiselling. It's one of those things that looks deceptively simple when you first start off woodworking, yet as soon as you take this thing to your work, you end up mashing it up so much that it looks like a dodgy kebab. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing various tips, tricks and techniques to make your chiselling more reliable, safer and just a bit more enjoyable really. So let's go. Now, quick disclaimer before we get started. Everything I say in this video is in the context of fine woodworking and furniture making. It is not in the context of rough carpentry or timber framing. So if you're one of those two people and you want to give me grief for things that I'm saying here, saying, oh, you wouldn't see that going on site and things like that, this disclaimer is for you. So without further ado, let's get started. So very quick lesson on the anatomy of a chisel. You have got a perfectly flat back on there, needs to be dead flat, and you've got a bevel on there. So this has been sharpened with a 25-degree primary bevel and a 30-degree secondary bevel. So if you haven't seen my video on how to get a deadly sharp edge on a chisel, I will put the link to it up here, because in order for these tips and techniques and things to work, you need to have a sharp chisel. So tip number one, don't be stupid. And if I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit, what I mean is don't hold the work while you're chiseling it. You know, there's only one way that's going to go, and that is through your finger. And yes, I know, this sounds obvious. Why would you have your hand behind the workpiece while you're chiseling towards it? That just seems absurd. But in all of my evening classes, and when I was starting off woodworking, myself included, we still feel a need to do this sometimes. And the reason for this is simple. It's because when they're chiseling, they're pushing their bodies back along the floor, and as a result they're having to brace themselves against the nearest possible thing, usually the timber that you're chiseling, in order to hold their feet in place. But if you boil all of this down to one thing, it's because you're asking too much of the chisel. One thing you need to know about these is that you want to be taking off as little amount of material as possible with them. Because of the wedging action of this, there's only so much material that this can travel through before it wedges itself in place. So if I try and take off, I don't know, about 5 mil here, no matter how hard I press, that is not going to go in and my feet are skimming across the floor. Whereas if I take off 0.5 mil, straight through like that, you'll see I'm able to get both hands behind the chisel like this. Once again, 5mm off, feet are skimming along the floor, and as a result I'm going to try and hold myself in place, and as soon as that chisel slips, all that pressure is going to, no fingerprint scanners for you anymore. Now some of you might be saying, well, I am only taking off 0.5mm of material, yet I'm still doing the moonwalk along the floor. Well, the answer to that is also quite simple. Your chisel isn't sharp. If I have a nice sharp chisel, it just glides through like that, nice and easy. Whereas if I was to get this file, for example, it hasn't got a sharp end on it, it's not going to cut. Now I know what I'm saying here probably sounds like I'm taking the mick a little bit, but you will be surprised how many people I have seen stab themselves for no reason whatsoever, other than the fact their chisel is blunt or they're attempting to chop down a tree with one of these things. There is no need for it. By either sharpening your chisel or taking off less material, there will be no need to hold the workpiece from behind and stab your finger off. The only exception to this being if you're working with a very, very hard and dense wood and you've got your chisel nice and sharp, you're still taking off minimal amounts, yet you're still being pushed along the floor. That is probably down to your stance. So when you're chiseling, instead of doing it like this, with your feet side by side, there's more of a chance to just be rocked back like that, and I can't get as much force behind my chiseling. If you stand sideways like this, put the chisel into the work, and then literally just press off your back leg, you will get so much more control, and also a little bit more power behind what you do as well. So all I've done here is hand is on the back of the chisel like that, wrapped around it, and then elbow is locked into the side of my body, and then force is just being transferred from my back leg on there. Now, even by applying pressure from your back leg, as I just showed you, you're going to get more control from that, but there will still be the odd instance where you slip and it goes all the way through. Firstly, thank God your hand isn't there. But secondly, a way to prevent this is to actually use your finger as a depth stop on here. So you'll see that I'm obviously holding it in the handle here, but then this one is holding the chisel underneath it like this, and it is actually acting as a depth stop. So if I press really hard, if it slips, you see in this instance, it made the chisel ramp up like that before it hit the back edge. That's because I've got this lovely sloping surface here. If I move it up a little bit, let's give myself a bit more clearance. So now I can use my finger right up against the wood like this, and just push it through like that. And now I can't go beyond halfway. So in this instance, I'm using my hand as a brake while being pressed against the material. But if you're just working with a quick release vise, for example, you could shift your hand back and use the jaws of the actual vise to act as a brake instead. But what I'm saying here is just don't attack it like this, holding the chisel with both hands at the back, because you can't really get any control from that. Apart from anything, holding the chisel down the bottom here allows you to really focus on where you want to be taking that material from. Whereas back here, it's just not quite as precise. Like, imagine trying to write with a pencil while holding it up the top here like this. What's going to give you more control? Holding it up here or holding it down the bottom like this? Which moves swiftly onto our next topic, which is chopping down. So we've just covered pairing. Now we're going to do chopping. So pairing is usually when you're working across the timber like this with two hands on the chisel. It's not limited to that, but in most cases that's what pairing is. I would class chopping as when you're using a chisel in conjunction with a mallet, because then you'd be chopping down into the timber, perhaps you're chopping across it like this. I don't know, I think it's one of those grey area things, but as I said before, just because there's a handle at the top of the chisel here, do not feel inclined to hold it up here while you're working. We have a very, very precise knife line here to work to. If I've got my hand up here, it's difficult to get the chisel into that line. Whereas if you hold it down the bottom like this, exactly as you would with a pencil, exactly the same grip, straight in the line like that, no fuss needed. As you might be able to see, the other benefit of this being, because my hand is closer to the bottom of the chisel, it means it can also act as a brake or depth stop, similar to how we did with the pairing. So there you go, chiseling down. Now, while chopping down into that timber, what that's done is left me with a little bit in the corner that needs to be cleaned out. And in order to clean it out, you need to pair it out with a chisel. But instead of me going back round and clamping it in the vise and things like that, sometimes I get lazy with it and it's very easy to just remove that with a chisel. And this is the only exception where I will hold the material while I'm pairing it. And it comes down, again, to holding the chisel down here, as opposed to at the handle like this. So I've got this little bit of material I want to remove. Going to hold the chisel, so about 20 millimeters of it is exposed, and then simply just going to press it through like that. You see my hand, for starters, isn't behind that exposed bit of the joint. Just a little bit of the chisel exposed beyond my hand, and then I cannot go out the other side of that joint. My finger is acting as a depth stop. So on this side, clean this out as well. Flip it over. How much do I need sticking out? About that much. So come in from here. There we go, done very safely. You still need a nice sharp chisel to do this. If it's blunt, you're going to be pressing too hard, and it's simple. You need a sharp chisel to do that. Another great example of using your hand as a depth stop is when chopping out the center of dovetails. Because as some of you know, I like to do an undercut on these, which means chopping down 90 degrees for a few mil or so, and then angling the chisel out like this to provide a small dip in the middle, which helps the joint go together. However, if I held the chisel up at the top here and start chopping down, do my undercut. What I've done, because there hasn't been a depth stop on there, you see on this opposite side, I've cut way below the baseline on here. Whereas if I hold the chisel down the bottom here, firstly, it's a lot easier to get into that line, and I can just easily get a feel as to what depth I need to be at on these. There you go, hit halfway, clear out the waste, and it is perfect on both of those faces. So now we're going to focus on chopping back to a marking gauge line or a knife line, and we're going to get the old macro lens for this. So what we have here is a knife line going along here, and then we've got a wall that has been cut down with a saw, and we need to chisel back to this line. Now remember what I said before about taking off too much material? Same rule applies here, but for different reasons. Because we're chopping down into this, we're not going to be scooting around the floor like we did before, obviously, but you need to be aware of the cutting action of a chisel. When you're chopping into material with these, that angle on the end being 30 degrees, the chisel is going to try and bisect that angle, and as a result, when it goes down, it's going to want to try and push back like this into the material that we want to keep. So if I try and take off all of this material we've got here and give it a few whacks, yes, it has gone through it, and yes, it helps that I've got a very sharp chisel, but what it has done on a very, very small scale is push that knife line back into this material. You might be able to see it ever so slightly on this back bit here. You've got the knife line, and then it steps back a tiny amount. Now, this is only because I was taking off about 2mm here. If I was taking off 3mm of material, that's going to be pushed back even further. So what I tend to teach people here is when removing this material, keep halving it until you can't halve it anymore. So we have about 2mm. We'll take off 1mm of it. Now we have 1mm, so we'll take off 0.5mm of it. And when you're about 0.5mm away, that usually means that it's safe to go into that line. So holding the chisel near the bottom, put the chisel into the line, and then tap it through. And because there's less material pressing on the bevel here, it's a lot less likely to press the chisel back into that knife line. Now, chopping down into material like this can be quite a tough job, but it's usually made a lot easier, as always, by not taking off as much material or sharpening your chisel. But what a lot of people resort to is using a smaller chisel to do it. Because there's less surface area on the end of the chisel, it's a lot easier to just whack it through like that. It makes the process a lot easier, and they just work their way along the line like this. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Until you look at this inside face here. The camera might not be picking it up, but look at all these facets in here. So by this point, they'll go back and try and just fish it all out like that, but then you end up creating more facets in there. And if this chisel isn't very sharp, then this is what I meant at the start, where it makes your work end up looking like a dirty kebab that you'd pick up after a night out. It's so easy to absolutely muller the work from this point. Whereas on this other side, if you're using a nice wide chisel, you can see how different that surface looks in there. We've got this little area in the middle where I demonstrated taking off too much material at once. You can see that it's a little bit chopped up in there, and it is a little bit stepped back from these edges, which are spot on the line. But overall, the cleanliness and crispness of that face is a lot better than what we saw on the opposite face. And on a side note, if I wanted to clean up that area that I chopped with the chisel that was too small, instead of chopping down to it as I was doing just then, I would have it upright in the vise like this, hand on the back of the chisel like this, back foot behind me, and then just push it through like that, taking off very, very small amounts at a time. And just clean up that inside face with a nice wide, sharp chisel. The only thing to look out for while you're doing this is that you're not massively undercutting this shoulder here, because if a bit of material's going in here, you're going to take out too much material on this bottom section here, and there will be a gap, which then moves on to our next subject. Now, this next tip is focused on the positioning of the workpiece and the workpiece in relation to you. So I've re-knifed some lines on the lap joint here, and we're going to chop down to them again. Now, remember what I said in the vise over there about undercutting the shoulders? That's going to give you a gap. Positioning yourself so that you can see the chisel descend vertically, or plumb, whatever, will prevent you from undercutting the shoulders, or prevent you from, I guess it's overcutting the shoulders. Undercutting the shoulders would result in a gap being exposed, whereas overcutting them would result in the joint getting tighter as it goes into the cavity, because essentially the walls are slipped in like this, kind of like a backwards dovetail sort of thing. So when I'm chopping down to these lines, what I want to be doing is standing here. So then when I put the chisel into them, I'm looking directly down that line there, and I can see by the right angle created here that the chisel is going down vertically. Whereas if I was to stand here, you can see that there is no way of me telling if that is 90 degrees or not. Yes, I can see if it's going in at a slope this way, but is that really that important? Not at all in the instance of this joint. What is important is that it is going down at a perfect 90 degrees. So by positioning myself so I can look along the line, chisel goes into it. You can actually put a square against the back of it if you really want to, act as a visual guide, and then you have hit it at a perfect 90 degrees down like that. Now, standing yourself in a position so you can see the chisel descending is something very important for most joints. However, it is probably the most important for things like mortise and tenon joints. So this is one that I cut in one of my tutorial videos about half a year ago. I'll put the link to it up there, but let me briefly explain this to you. So what I have in front of me here is the mortise component for this mortise and tenon, the mortise being the hole in there. And when I chopped this out, I did it with a chisel. And by standing at the side like this, I could see if I was chopping down vertically with the chisel, which is all very well. But what I couldn't see at this angle I'm currently standing at is this angle. I couldn't see if the chisel was going down parallel in reference to the sides here. So as a result, if I positioned myself here while chopping out the mortise, when the tenon goes in, it could have gone in at an angle like this, because I might have been over angling the chisel or I might have been under angling the chisel, if that's even a word. But there is not a chance that I would have got it in perfectly straight. So instead what I did was stand here looking along the length of the mortise, so then when I chiseled down I could see if the chisel was going in at a perfect 90 degrees, and then the tenon, when it goes in, would be nice and straight in there. And then with most of that meat removed, so I know that it's going down perfectly straight, I still had a little bit down the bottom here that I needed to clean up, but by standing here, I couldn't see if the chisel was going in straight this way. So again, if I went at an angle, the tenon would have tightened up too much as it went in. So with all of it removed, I then swapped back here and took the final chop this way, so then I could see if the chisel was going down a perfect 90 degrees or not. If it was over tilting or under tilting, it wouldn't have mattered too much by this point because the main meat of the mortise was removed anyway, and this chisel would have tracked it down. So as you can see, by simply changing your body position, changing the angle of the material, it can be the difference between making your woodworking a misery or an absolute joy. Because doing something like this, where you have the material upright in the vise, and then you just whack it through with a mallet, you can't see that angle. You're just blindly removing material and there's going to be undercuts, overcuts all over the place. Position yourself in such a way that you can see this chisel descending in the direction that you want it to. And this demonstration here leads on to my next point. And that point is power transfer. Now this isn't a massive issue with this workbench because it is just rock solid, but those of you working on something less solid than this, that I imagine is a large majority of you, this will be a good demonstration for you. So back to this halving joint, we want to chop down to these walls still. Not making very much progress with this, are we? So you've put this directly in the middle of your workbench and you're ready to start chopping down to it. So let's do that. See all that bouncing going on? That's making my chisel go in all sorts of directions, and it's making me whack a lot harder than what I need to. And that's because every time I whack into it, this material below is deflecting and it's making this bounce over the place, and the power is not being transferred very efficiently. It's going through this, and then into dead space below. Whereas if I was to chop it directly above this solid bit here, so it's going to go through the plywood, into the bit of wood, and then into my workbench, you can see that you get far more control from it. So on a workbench, you have 4 of these areas that I've just demonstrated, and that is above every single leg on the top of your workbench. Unless you have 5 legs, obviously, then you have 5 points. So moving back to chopping out this mortise, when I was doing it, I had the option to have the material around this way so that it was closer to me as I worked to it, which would have been a lot easier. The issue is that when I was whacking down into it, it would have been whacking down into this dog block here, which has a little bit of empty space below. The mechanism is screwed into the workbench. There's going to be all sorts of deflection going on and wasted power. So instead, what I did was put it directly over the leg on my workbench and then cramped it in place like that. So now the power is going through the workpiece, through the leg in the workbench, which is connected directly to the concrete floor below me, which then goes right down to the earth's core. Sounds a little bit more robust than this area here, doesn't it? And I know that I'm lucky with a workbench like this in that the top is so thick that I don't get the kind of deflection that we have going on with this example that I showed you here. However, saying that, despite this top being 5 inches thick, I still notice the difference between working in this area here and working directly above a leg, which is pretty astounding considering how heavy this bench is. So there we go, guys. That is pretty much all I have to say about chiseling. So in summary, they're for taking off small, precise bits of material. They're not for heavy stock removal unless you're mortising or if you're doing any strategic splitting of timber, which is something that I did in my hand cut joint series quite a lot, where I was cutting half lap joints such as this or dovetail halving joints, things like that. So I'll put the link to that series up there if you're interested in how to hand cut certain joints. So we covered dovetails, mortise and tenons, sliding dovetail joints, bridle joints. There's all sorts going on in there, and will be a great way for you to practice a lot of these chisel techniques. So if you have any of your own tips that you want to share, chuck them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.